Today, we're going to learn how to give advice in English like a native English speaker would. So, you already know you should and you ought to. Those are modals to give advice in English. But native English speakers use expressions to give advice in English. We use modals too, but more often we're going to use language expressions. In this video, we're going to look at common language advice expressions that native English speakers use. We will look at the pronunciation and the grammatical structure of those expressions. We will look at how to accept and refuse advice and conclude with a conversation using those native advice expressions. Here are the first three advice expressions, also known as advice language functions. My advice is to, how about, and what about. And the next three popular language expressions for advice are have you tried, why don't you, and if I were you, I would. We're going to look at each of these more closely and their pronunciation too. So let's start with the pronunciation. My advice is to. My advice is to. How about? How about? What about? What about? Have you tried? Have you tried? Why don't ya? Why don't ya? If I were you, I'd. That I would becomes contracted to I'd. If I were you, I'd. Okay, so let's practice. I'm going to introduce a problem and then we will practice giving advice and practice the pronunciation together. The first four we will use is my advice is to, what about, have you tried, and how about. So the first problem is, I want to lose some weight before I go on vacation. Do you have any advice? And then you would give me the advice and say, my advice is to eat more vegetables. You see the pronunciation? My advice is to eat more vegetables. What about exercising every day? What about exercising every day? And the other two expressions, have you tried? Have you tried doing intermittent fasting? Have you tried? How about eating less? You could eat smaller portions. How about eating less? Let's continue to work with the pronunciation as I introduce more problems. So I will introduce another problem and we will practice giving advice and pronouncing the last two expressions. Why don't ya? And if I were you, I'd. Okay, here we go. The next problem is, I hate my job and I don't know what to do. Advice you would give would be, why don't you get another job? Why don't you? Why don't you get another job? If I were you, I'd go back to school. If I were you, I'd go back to school. So let's look more closely at the grammatical form these expressions use. The first three that we're going to look at here use the same grammatical form, so you can group them together. My advice is to plus a base verb. Why don't you plus a base verb? And if I were you, I'd plus a base verb. Here are some grammar examples of those expressions using the base verb. Why don't you get another job? Get is the base verb. My advice is to eat more vegetables. Eat is the base verb. If I were you, I'd go back to school. So these three expressions are very simple to use. Just slip a base verb in and then give your advice. And the next three have the same grammatical form also. Have you tried? How about? And what about? They go with a gerund. Now, the gerund is that verb that is in the ing form. I'm assuming you know what a gerund is. If you don't, you can look at a gerund video I've made under my playlist in the grammar. But let's look at these three expressions and how they use a gerund. What about exercising every day? Exercising is the ing verb, and that's the gerund verb. Have you tried doing intermittent fasting? Doing intermittent fasting? How about eating less? You could eat smaller portions. Eating is the gerund. So what happens after you give advice? Well, they have to accept your advice or reject it, and there are expressions for that too. How do you accept advice? Here are the following expressions you can use. Thanks, that's great advice. That's a good point. I'll do that, thanks. That sounds good. These are very nice expressions to accept advice. How do you reject advice? I will think about it. I don't know. Maybe you listen for the tone. I don't know. Maybe it's a lighter, less direct tone. I don't think I can do that. But if you're friends, you could say, "No way. Are you crazy?" In English, we soften our negative responses. You can't say, "No, I don't like your advice." You have to sort of like indicate you've heard the advice and you're thinking about it, but you don't really like it. It won't work for you. So, how does advice and accepting and rejecting all of it work? It's like a game of tennis. Someone pretty much introduces a problem. They tell you about a problem they're having, and then you give advice, which is like suggestions to solutions to their problem. And they either like your advice or they don't. If they like it, they accept it. If they don't, they reject it. That means that if they don't like your first advice, you could suggest another piece of advice to their problem if you wanted. Now, listen to two English speakers talking about a problem and giving advice.
I want to improve my English, but I don't know what to do.
What about taking an English class in the evenings?
I don't think I can do that. I'm too tired after work to do anything else.
Okay, have you tried making a friend who speaks English?
That's great advice. Amy speaks English very well, and we can hang out on the weekends at the same time. Thanks.
So you can see I had to give two pieces of advice because he rejected my first piece and accepted the second. Now, your turn. I will introduce one more problem. I think my boyfriend is cheating on me. I don't know what to do. What advice would you give me? Use one of these advice language functions and leave a comment below if you're interested in actually writing it. I will conclude with the pronunciation one more time of these 6 expressions. My advice is to, what about, why don't ya, have you tried, if I were you, I'd, how about. That's it for today.